Welcome to Upstream. I'm Shane Morris. Ever since I was a kid, I have loved the natural world. Trees, insects, reptiles, sharks, birds. I just couldn't get enough of these things. At some point, I came to the realization that many of these features of God's creation are in serious danger of being destroyed. But when I brought up this fact to many fellow Christians, particularly those of a conservative persuasion, I often met with dismissiveness and even disinterest. Books and blogs that my friends read mocked this idea of caring for endangered species and the environment as an obsession of liberal tree huggers. Being concerned for the environment was even portrayed as somehow at odds with the pro-life cause and the creation mandate to take dominion over the earth. Well, is this really how we as Christians should approach God's world as His appointed stewards, or is there something missing here? My guest today has spent much of his career making the case that we need a better approach to this whole issue of ecology. Dr. Rick Lindroth is a professor of ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He also studies forest and wildlife biology. He was recently profiled by Sarah Pulliam-Bailey in the Washington Post as a voice talking about ecology through a lens of hope, motivated by Christian faith. And today, I want to talk with him about the state of ecology in Christian thought and how a creation connection can move people to better care for God's beautiful handiwork. Dr. Lindroth, welcome to Upstream.
Hey, thank you, Shane. Really happy to be here.
Well, you seem to find yourself as a man caught between two different stories about the natural world, both of which you have serious issues with. One is the secular view that sees humans as kind of just another animal among the rest that happens at this point in history to be destroying the world. And the other is this common Christian view that I summarized a second ago that looks at environmentalism with great suspicion. How would you describe your views and your overall approach that avoids those two errors?
I'll have to say it is a challenge. Whenever one is building a bridge between two different communities, you can get stepped on from both sides, right? So, my perspectives on the science of ecology, and ecology is really a science, it's not environmentalism, it's a science of how the natural world works, is informed largely by what the scientists say. And I have really no question about the scientific basis of that field as a disciplinary area of study. When we carry our understanding of ecology into how we should be treating the environment, then we leave the domain of science per se and move more into the area of morals and ethics. And every person has a moral framework or ethical framework that determines how they view the world. And mine, of course, is uniquely shaped by my Christian underpinnings and understanding. And so I see that our imperative to care for the world and to treat it well draws not only from our understanding of the science, but our understanding of Scripture. And that is that all of creation does not exist for the people, for the purpose of people, but to give honor and praise to God, and that people were given the charge to care and tend for that creation on behalf of each other, and to, of course, allow it to flourish and to bring praise and glory to God.
I love that distinction that you're making there, and this was brought out in the Washington Post piece a little bit as well, that taking dominion and subduing, which is, of course, the language that we read in Genesis where we get the creation mandate, is often sort of misunderstood in English. You make the case that it's better to read it in terms that don't suggest the sort of destruction or exploitation of the environment. Talk to us about what that alternative is.
Sure. So the word used in the first chapter of Genesis to convey dominion is the word in Hebrew, rada. And humans are charged to rada the entire creation. And that word rada is translated differently throughout the Old Testament. Sometimes it means to trod down, to have dominion over, to rule over. Sometimes it's more in terms of nurturing and caretaking and stewarding. So how do we discern what is the appropriate meaning of that word in that context. Well, those verses are bookended by descriptions of people, humans, being created in God's image. So, in essence, we are to rada the earth. We are to rule over the earth in the image of God. Well, what would that be? We are to rule over the earth as God would. That is, with nurturing, with benevolence, with care, with concern for its flourishing, not only for ours. So I think that's probably a better understanding of what it means to rule over or have dominion over, in contrast to it's there for our use and for our subjugation.
Right. It's interesting when you read about this sort of application of the text historically, because there is this common narrative that runs through the story of man's dealing with the natural world that kind of goes like this: that at some point we turned a corner from being at war with the forces of nature to being essentially dominant over the forces of nature. So in industrialization, we turned the corner from being subject to all these famines and locust plagues and weather events and so forth, to being able to a large extent control or mitigate a lot of this stuff. And it's bred this sort of, in my view, it's bred a sort of attitude that's very different from the attitude that someone who's subject to a lot of those forces or in an agrarian setting would have. Not only in terms of like a daily encounter with the environment and the natural world, but also an awe or a reverence for it. The kind of thing you see in Job, where there's, God adduces examples of the power of the natural world and says, all these things that frighten you, I'm in control of. So how do you think our modern situation has affected our view of what it means to take dominion, and what our relationship with the natural world should be, and how can we correct that?
That's a huge question. So I'll take it in parts, and maybe you can bring me back around.
I'm infamous for asking huge, unanswerable questions. Just take your best shot at it.
Right. So the problem with human societies, with civilization in the natural world, is not uniquely one of Christians. It's worldwide. And you're right. We do have this. I would describe it as arrogance, that humans are somehow quite separate from the rest of the natural world, and it's not only our prerogative but our duty to use it to our benefit. And that has led to all kinds of environmental degradation and environmental problems, many of which now we are starting to understand as being serious, not only for the natural world, but for the continuation of human civilization as we know it. And so that arrogance, that pride, that hubris is what lies behind, I think, a lot of the environmental problems that we are experiencing today. What I try to help people to understand is that we are deeply embedded within the natural world. The study of ecology is really the study of how do the components of the natural world, the soil, the atmosphere, the animals, the plants, all organisms, how do they interact? And so my emphasis in terms of environmentalism is how do and how should humans interact with the natural world. And we need to understand that we are deeply, deeply embedded within it. Every breath we take, every drop of water we drink is due to what we call ecosystem services. These are services that the natural world provides to us and that sustain life as we know it. And so it's not only arrogant, it is dangerous to think that humans can live apart from a deep embeddedness within and caretaking for the environment. The former senator and governor of my state of Wisconsin, Gaylord Nelson, who founded the first Earth Day, once said that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. So to think that we can have a flourishing economy independent of a flourishing environment is really, in the minds of ecologists, simply ludicrous.
There's this other element that I see of just not a view of exploitation or a sort of a sense of arrogance that we can do what we like with the natural world, but just an ignorance of it, a sense that this is not important. I don't need to think or care about this. And it's bred by this radical disconnectedness from nature that really pervades the modern world, where our screens, our cars, our climate control, our factory farming, all of these things insulate us from the forces that I mentioned earlier. And it leads us to a place where it's not that we intentionally exploit the environment, it's that we just don't care. We just don't care what's going on out there because we're in our little artificial human-made hamster tunnels all the time, doing what we do, and the bears and squirrels that do what they do out there. But it has nothing to do with us. We don't realize that the air we breathe is because plankton is making oxygen for us. But you have this exercise that the Washington Post piece describes. Talk to us about that, where you take people out and ask them to identify the leaves of trees and then contrast that.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So now you're touching on a subject that I've been thinking a lot about over the last few years. And even within Christian circles and communities that try to advance care for creation and creation stewardship, I think we're not emphasizing quite the right things, because we continue to be encouraged to care for creation. But most people are entirely disconnected from creation. They don't really understand what it means to care for something that they're disconnected from. I think I was quoted or referenced in that same article as saying that we care for the things we love, and we love the things that we are intimately connected to. We're not going to care for things that we're not connected to. So the very first step that I'm encouraging groups, individuals to do is to start reestablishing or establishing those connections to creation. There's an artist and naturalist I know who works in California who, when asked a similar question, what can we do, what should we do, told his audience, go put your feet in a river. And I love that, because his first response is, don't recycle. It was not to recycle or do other things, but was to establish that connection with creation. So what I like to do to challenge people in this regard is ask them, or say, the next time you walk through a shopping center, a retail area, how many companies can you identify by their logo? An apple with a bite out of it, a swoosh, you name it. And then ask, how many trees can you identify by their leaves? And usually that helps people to understand, I'm really fully embedded. I understand. I'm connected to this commercial world around me. I'm not really connected to the natural world at all. So, yes, we need to be caring for creation, but I think a very first step in that regard is to reestablish that creation connection. And I've been promoting his book for, 6-8 years, ever since it's been published, but Scott Sampson's book, How to Raise a Wild Child, The Art and Science of Nature Connection, is a tremendous resource if any of your guests would like to understand not only how they can help their children, but help themselves reestablish that nature connection. It's a great resource. And then building on that connection is where we can then start being drawn almost automatically into creation care. I love to talk about the two books of Revelation as described by David in Psalm 19. He first talks about the book of the world, or the book of nature, and then goes on to talk about the book of the Word. And this goes back for millennia. Even Augustine, way back in the 400s, wrote, some people, in order to discover God, read books. But there is a great book, the very appearance of created things. Look above you, look below you, note it, read it. God, whom you want to discover, never wrote that book with ink. Instead, He set before your eyes the things that he had made. Can you ask for a louder voice than that? So, in some of the discussions I have on this topic, I argue that people have become disconnected from the first book of God's revelation. It does not say that we should not be or should be. I'm not saying anything about the second book, which of course is extremely important. But I would argue that we've forgotten the value, the importance, the essence of that first book of understanding God and being deeply embedded with understanding his created order.
I had a guest on a while back. His name was David Haynes, and he wrote a book about natural theology, what we can know about God from creation itself. And one of the points he made was that the book of Scripture actually assumes and requires a pretty robust knowledge of the book of nature. That you throughout Scripture, the authors assume that you're going to know what they're talking about when they use imagery and metaphors and just all kinds of threads from the natural world and pull them in and say, this is what we're saying about God. If you don't have those threads, you quite simply don't understand what the Bible is saying. And so that's to me a major clue that something is going on here, that as we live in our curated, air-conditioned, and cut off in artificial environments, that we're actually depriving ourselves of something essential. But the other clue comes from just the really practical effects of what you see when people are exposed to the natural world. My wife is reading Andrew Peterson's latest book. It's called God of the Garden. And he cites this research in there that shows that when people are exposed to greenery, to plants, when they're surrounded by a forest or trees, or hear the wind going through the leaves, their blood pressure immediately goes down, their cortisol levels immediately go down, their body starts healing, their cells divide more quickly. I mean, it's like mind-blowing stuff. And it's almost as if we're supposed to be there. It's almost as if we're missing a vital connection. And I wonder what that does to us on all sorts of levels, not just the level of, oh, I should care for this. I should be motivated not to destroy this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's excellent. There's a term that is applied to that condition you were just describing called nature deficit disorder. And it's been documented through many studies, especially with children, but with adults as well, that the more disconnected people are from nature, the more they tend to have heart, cardiovascular issues, obesity, attention deficit problems, etc., etc. And when people are re-immersed back into some form of connection with the natural world, and it doesn't have to be, a hike in the mountains. It can be a walk in your local park. It can be observing a flower in your flower pot. That exactly all of the things that you just described can happen. Blood pressure decreases and healing commences. So that connection with nature is not only good for nature, it's good for us, and it's good for our understanding of who God is and how he created the earth to function.
Well, I set this conversation up with my own experience of just sort of being puzzled by the Christian reaction to concern for the environment, for the natural world, and for specific things about it, like an endangered species, for instance. And yet, as we've, walked through the underpinnings of Christian ecology, it seems like we're wonderfully set up as a faith, as a people, to see this issue rightly. Where does this dismissiveness that Christians have toward ecology come from, if not from, Scripture itself?
Wow, another really large question. There are many elements to that, but let's just say for now that environmental issues have not always been as hyperpolarized as they are today. And in fact, I'm old enough to remember when rivers would catch on fire. In the 60s, early 70s, we had terrible water pollution. We had really bad air pollution. We had acid rain. We had all kinds of environmental problems. And people came to understand that, hey, these are serious. They're impacting not only the natural world, but humans as well, and our economy. We need to do something about it. And there was very strong bipartisan support for passing major federal legislation, and one act after another was passed in the early 70s under a Republican president who established the EPA, right? So there was strong bipartisan support. Unfortunately, over the last 20 to 30 years in particular, there has been this hyperpolarization about virtually any issue we can think of. I mean, who would have thought 2 years ago that a vaccine or wearing a facial covering could be so hyperpolarizing? But it is, and we just seem to do that. I think, unfortunately, environmental concerns have been couched from and advanced largely from liberal perspectives, and therefore viewed with some suspicion, dismay, denial by people who tend to be more conservative, which would include, I think, many of the Christians in your audience. And that's really unfortunate, because if we go back, 100, 200 years, or, the origins of conservation and conservation biology, hunting and fishing, a lot of that was strongly conservation-oriented, which is really a fundamental conservative value, right? But we've tended to lose those, and to just think that, well, caring for the environment is a liberal concern. I love the work of Jonathan Haidt, who now many in your audience probably have heard of, because his prominent article just published just this month in The Atlantic, something to the effect of how the last 10 years have become so stupid.
I sent him an email and a bouquet of flowers asking him to come on Upstream, and he hasn't replied yet. So if you know him, please tell him, pay attention to me. I want to talk to him.
I think everybody wants his attention, right? He's just
Yes.
marvelous. He's such a great thinker, and his recent article, I felt, just really nailed it. Well, Haidt is a moral psychologist, a social psychologist at New York University, and he's been working in this arena for many years. First published many of his thoughts in the book called The Righteous Mind. And what he has done is shown that there are different moral frameworks that differentiate liberals from conservatives. That liberals value things like care and fairness more, and conservatives value things like purity and loyalty and authority more. Now, they aren't completely distinct, but they're strong tendencies, right? And so even the term creation care is going to resonate with liberals more than it does with conservatives, because liberals their brain wiring is such that they are concerned about those things more than they are things like liberty, not liberty, but authority and sanctity, purity. So part of the problem is that environmental issues have been caught in this environmental divide, and because they have been couched in environmental terms for so long, conservatives tend to just kind of dismiss them. Now, fortunately, I think, and maybe it's because things are getting so bad, especially in terms of climate change, conservatives are waking up, especially younger people. There are strong conservative movements now, political and environmental movements among conservatives, to say, hey, we need to start showing up and shouldering this responsibility also. And so I'm looking forward to strong conservative narratives to emerge on how we should be addressing some of these critical environmental issues, such as climate change or extinction of species. But largely, I think the answer is that we work out of different world frames, world views, and our approach to caring for the environment has been influenced by them, and largely the conservatives have left that up to the liberals. Fortunately, I think the conservatives are coming around, and hopefully we can be talking more, better between the two camps.
As you're talking about the Heights research on this, I couldn't help think of something that Jordan Peterson actually said about how liberals and conservatives tend to choose their political beliefs as functions of personality traits. And so he says that liberals tend to be very high in trait openness, whereas conservatives tend to be very high in trait conscientiousness. And those, out of those traits emerge exactly the sort of trends that you're describing. And different types of language appeal to people, different sorts of arguments appeal to people. And he actually says, not to get too far off track here from ecology, but he actually says that the immigration debate is a mystery to you until you understand these two personality traits, and that conscientiousness sees national integrity as primary and crucial, whereas openness sees, it's in the word, it sees, openness and magnanimity toward all of mankind as crucial. And so that's where you get them butting heads. But on the environment, there are these very similar trends that take place where if you have an ethic that's centered on care and that's centered on taking trouble to cause the thriving of someone or something, you're going to tend to be progressive, and you're going to tend to respond to that kind of language. That leads to this question, because I want to talk about worldview underpinnings in a second, but this is I think an important question. What language would you use to appeal to those with a conservative instinct on the environment? Okay,
good. I'm going to give a very quick answer and then come back around to it. I would use language that emphasizes conservation, that emphasizes sanctity or purity, that this was created, the earth was created and God declared it as good, as very good, and that it is our responsibility as being loyal followers of our God to care for that with which He's charged us. So those types of words, I think, the loyalty, the maintaining the sanctity or purity of, those types, conserving, doing this because we've always done it, and in a way to conserve, to reduce our demands. I think those are the types of things that might ring more strongly with conservatives. They certainly do with certain members of my extended family who would be considered, political conservatives. So those are some of the ways that I would go about it. When I think it's important to, in having these conversations, to remember that if there is an issue, it's not one of insufficient information. It's one of insufficient trust. So when especially conservatives are maybe dismissive towards some particular environmental issue, climate change, extinction of species, you name it, it's not because they don't have enough information. It's not an information deficit. It's because they don't have enough trust. It's a trust deficit. There is not any one experiment or any one study that would provide sufficient information to change their minds. Right? So if we pick on one particularly important, in my mind, the existentially important environmental issue of the day, climate change, and ask ourselves, what is the demographic factor that most aligns with being dismissive of the reality of human-caused climate change? What would you or what would your audience say? And when I say demographic factor, I'm thinking things like age, sex, education, location, income, religion, all of those things. What would be the factor that is most closely tied to climate change denialism? And what the research shows is actually contrary to what most people would say. It's not education. And it's not religiosity. The one factor most closely tied to climate change and denialism is a political affiliation. And it's not even political values or political ideas, it's political affiliation. What party do you belong to? And again, I've seen that in some people I'm very close to, where their political values change in order to maintain their political affiliation over time. And so we see then that a lot of the concern of conservatives about environmental issues does not arise because of the issues themselves or because of the science or the lack of science. Those issues arise because they don't trust the people who are saying, hey, we've got a problem. They don't trust the scientists. Or because their particular tribal group, their in-group, it's just, of course, that's part of who we are. We dismiss the science on this because it's part of our identity to be anti-government or anti-science or anti-intellectual or anti-university, you name it. That's who we are. And so I think that's part of the problem that we need to work to get around. And how do you do that? Unfortunately, it's a really slow, difficult, hard process of first identifying common values, values that we share together, and then building bridges based on those common values, and ultimately helping people to understand that, hey, you know, your worldview your views on this particular topic are actually in conflict with your worldview. Your worldview would say we need to have a clean and safe and flourishing environment so that our children can live lives that are not, compromised by disease, by changing climate, whatever. Well, if we can agree we want that, and who doesn't want that, then maybe we can start shifting our ideas on, well, whether we should be burning fossil fuels or using renewable energy.
Yeah.
So,
but part of the difficulty here, Dr. Lindroth, is that all of this has become not only politicized in terms of like the political temperature, but it's all become a package deal. I know that there are people listening to this podcast, there will be, who the moment we switch to talking about climate change are thinking to themselves, oh no, Shane and Upstream have gone woke. They're talking about climate change now. And all of a sudden this list of associations and conclusions and judgments begin to unfold. And it's like, how do you grapple with something like that? I mean, this was an interesting example because I, for a long time, had that exact same reflex. And then a couple of years ago, a friend of mine who's just this huge meteorology nerd kind of challenged me and said, hey, maybe you need to unhitch some of these associations and assumptions you have with this issue that prevent you from considering it objectively and coolly. Because the moment, I brought it up to you, Shane, you acted like I was trying to do a one world government global political takeover and like deprive people of all their freedoms and regulate our daily lives at the UN headquarters or something. He's like, I'm not proposing any of that. In fact, I'm thinking from a very conservative standpoint of measuring externalities, right? What are the effects that we're not taking into account in the equation of our economy? Burning all this fossil fuels. Is there an external effect? And how is that hurting people and robbing them of their freedom ultimately? And that he put it in a different, set of language. He's like, you can't just go burn asbestos in your backyard and your neighbor not have anything to say about it because that's your property. It affects him. It affects his kids. And the same thing is true of, or at least the proposition is, the same thing is true of burning fossil fuels, that it's affecting the whole world. And so it seems to me like a big part of this task before us is just disconnecting or unhitching a lot of these associations that people automatically make and just saying, oh, you see some legitimacy to the science of climate change, you must therefore be X, Y, Z.
Right.
And
Right.
I
Yes.
will not listen to you. I'll shut you down. I mean, that's hard.
Yes, that is so very true, and I really like your personal example. That's tremendous, and I've talked to so many people who have had similar stories, and yes, I get shut down right and left because of this propensity for bundling.
Yes.
Right? If you believe this on a particular issue, then
you must want to kill babies.
you must believe this other thing. Right. I mean, I once introduced a prominent climate scientist before a group of people gathered together to hear talk about religion and Christianity and climate change. And somebody came up to me afterwards and said, if you believe in climate change, as if it's a belief system, but if you believe in climate change, then you must have voted for Obama. And if you voted for Obama, you cannot claim to be a Christian. Right. So what do we see there? The bundling and the bundling and the extended bundling, right, of how all these things go together. So if I would implore your audience to recognize that with respect to environmental issues, the Christian community has not only the right, but the responsibility and the honor and the privilege of seeking truth. I mean, if foremost among all of our values, whatever worldviews we have, we ought to be truth seekers, right? And so that's a moral imperative for us as Christians, is to be seeking the truth. And sometimes that's going to mean unbundling things that typically go together. Now, you talked about how your friend approached you with, talking about issues of climate change, etc. I wish it was always that easy, and here's why. When confronted with new information about the world, about the environment, about our faith, about anything, how do we determine whether or not to believe it? Well, most of us would say we're children of the Enlightenment, we're educated, so we would kind of weigh the pros and cons, and we'd assess it, and we'd determine whether we think it makes reasonable sense, and if it does, we'd incorporate it into our worldview, right? And we would be wrong. That's not what we do. None of us do. Some of us do it a little more than others. I would like to think that scientists do it a little more, but even we don't. What do? We first intuit a response, and then we use our reasoning faculties to back up why that intuition is correct. That's exactly.
There's a Latin term for that. It's an ad hoc reasoning.
Yes. Yeah. Right. And so what we use our reasoning for is to provide spin for why our intuition is correct. And that intuition is framed or determined by our moral frameworks, our values, etc. So we kind of have these knee-jerk, intuitive responses, and then we use our reasoning to back up why that intuition is correct. So we're not going to make a lot of progress, unfortunately, just by presenting reasonable arguments about particular issues. Now, they can be helpful. I mean, the whole area of Christian apologetics is about reasonable arguments. But first and foremost, we have to connect on the basis of values. What are our shared values? And then you can bring the reasoning along behind.
Let me back up and do sort of a devil's advocate here, because I think there's a strong way to present a sort of hesitance. And I know that I could, I'm thinking of the faces of people who I know and deeply respect who have this very strong hesitance on this particular facet of environmentalism or of, the science of ecology. And it really comes down to this obvious connection between concern over this issue on the left and a sort of religious hysteria that manifests in really weird behavior, monomaniacal sort of political campaigns, and then failed predictions hysterical failed predictions. So we've talked on Breakpoint about, Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb. Overpopulation is, this other separate thing that has become less popular in recent years, but used to be a big deal. And he made some predictions, and those predictions turned out to be pathetically wrong. I mean, none of them came true because of, the Green Revolution, mostly. The climate change issue has seen a whole slew of similar predictions. We could point back to Al Gore or, Greta Thunberg or Nancy Pelosi or and just any number of politicians, popularizers who go out and say, look, the world's going to end in this many years and this nation won't exist. And, 20 years go by and none of it's happened. So how do we disentangle the reality here from the hysteria? Because I think the instinct is to go, ew, I don't want any part of that. That's weird. And it even gets kind of religious at times in the secular left. How do you make that distinction?
Oh, wow. That's another excellent question. What the bigger question I think you're asking is, who do we believe? Who is our trusted truth authority? And I would argue that in areas of science, I will rely on the scientist to be my trusted truth authority. Now, some popularizers of science will make extreme predictions that don't come true, and then that sheds a poor light on science and scientists overall. But scientists are by nature a very conservative lot, and you really have to push them to go out on a limb and make predictions. And in reality, the predictions by scientists about climate change and the speed, the magnitude, the rapidity with which our climate is changing, scientists have historically under-anticipated the rate, the rapidity, the magnitude of change that is occurring. They've not overestimated it, they've underestimated it. If you look back over the history of the IPCC reports over the last, however they've been coming out, 25 years. Yeah. They've tended to underestimate the rapidity with which the environment is changing.
And I think most people don't read those. They just read the headlines about them. And that's part of the issue. Exactly. Right?
And here's where I'm at an advantage, or perhaps a bit at a disadvantage in relationship to most of your audience, is that I'm a scientist, and so I'm comfortable pursuing the scientific authorities. But actually, much of this information is immediately available to anybody with with a cell phone in their pocket or access to a keyboard. And that is this: it's both a good and bad. It used to be that libraries and universities served as gateways to truth about our world. And we can throw seminaries in there as well. But in the last 20 years, the gateway to information about the world is something we carry in our pocket. And so we can access all kinds of information. So the issue now is not what is the information, but what is trustworthy information and what is not. If I had a child who came down with leukemia, I could go onto my keyboard and Google cures for leukemia, and I'm sure I could come up with some herbal tea or some type of special bracelet that child could wear, and that there would be an MD or a PhD behind some name that would swear that this is going to cure them. But I don't do that. Who would I go to? I would go to the National Institutes of Health and see what they say about childhood leukemia. So what I encourage people to do is, on scientific topics, go to a scientifically reputable source. Well, then they say, what are those? Well, there are a bazillion of them, but for example, the National Academies of Science. Just go on your keyboard, type in National Academies of Science Climate Change, and they will have immediately accessible in very simple layman's terms, what does the science say about climate change? There are 201 organizations and scientific societies around the world that have published statements about climate change and the role of people in that. Of those 201, 198 affirm that it's real and that it's human caused. 3 are non-committal. 0 are opposed. And so in areas of science, go just Google something that is trustworthy, and if it has a .gov after it, then it's probably real science. Now, I know that many in your audience will have an immediate suspicion about anything that's government or science or university related. That's another entire topic that would be great for you to have a guest on your show about. But that's what I do.
I won't beg you to go, so far afield to talk about that sort of thing, because that's not. That's not really our focus. But that's clearly a reaction that many are going to have, and it's just sort of there are bigger questions we need to ask there. I think that I'm still working through about what does it mean to trust a source of authority, especially when those same authorities are like citing science as a reason to like transition little boys into little girls and things like that. There's a lot of muddying that's happened in the world of scientific authority in recent years. I do want to sort of ask this last question about climate change, and that is I think one of the more perceptive criticisms I've seen of climate change discourse in recent years has been that it has a tendency to suck all the air out of the room for other ecological issues. So for instance, I saw a New York Times story about this new study on the return of the Ivory-Billed Woodpecker in Louisiana, which is obviously kind of a creature of legend for many Southerners. It's like we long to see it return. There's whole little societies of ornithologists that go out and look for the woodpecker, and hobbyists. And there's some evidence now that it may actually not be extinct. But the author of this piece spent like half of the article sort of sharing her depression about climate change before she even got to talking about the woodpeckers and how they're probably still alive. And so the impression you got was just like, oh, anytime I think about the environment or animals or anything, all I can think about is climate change and how hopeless it is. But hey, here's a little spark of sunshine with the woodpecker maybe back. And it's like that just drains all the energy out of doing anything about issues that are small enough and local enough that you can actually make a difference. So what do you think about that? How do you balance concern for the evidence that points in the direction of anthropogenic climate change and our call to do something about that with this need to focus on other things like deforestation and extinction and plastics in the ocean and all that?
Yeah. There's a joke, and it's a not funny joke among ecologists, that no matter what you're studying and proposing for your next grant proposal, the summary of your grant proposal has to say something about climate change.
Right.
Even if it's completely unrelated, right? Because we do understand it's the 900-pound gorilla in the room, right? It's the big deal. But it's not everything. And there's all kinds of important ecological and environmental science and human endeavors that need to continue independent of addressing climate change directly. Now, one thing I will say is that, again, people tend to think in too much of siloed terms. So when people are thinking human health, when they're thinking economic health, when they're thinking national security, when they're thinking national infrastructure, they ought to be thinking about connections to climate change, because climate change affects all of those. But yeah, we should and ought to be out there seeking to protect endangered species, or cleaning up local rivers, or reducing our pollutant loads. All of those things are important. Let's be realistic. Human society, human civilization will be around for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? Humans are not going to go extinct because of climate change. No. Now, our civilization as we know it might change dramatically. And it's not like we're going to fall off the end of a cliff. It's gradual, it's rapid, and it's happening much faster than anyone anticipated 10, 20, 30 years ago. But it's not like we're going to, at some point, fall off the end of a cliff and then it's just doomed from there on. So any step that we can take now to reduce the speed is an important step and will have positive repercussions for something, for someone. So let's keep that in mind. And then, I think it's important to maintain hope. It's so easy to get disillusioned because of the magnitude of the issue. But hope does not mean unbridled optimism. There is another quote by Augustine who says that hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger to see things as they are, and courage to work so that they don't remain as they are. And so I can be a person of hope and simultaneously a person who looks at the world around me and is angry, but hopefully is also then engaged, not just enraged, but engaged to do something about it and to work toward an end that it has a better outcome. And that better outcome might just be to delay the onset of more serious problems or to help this local population of whatever, small fish, or to preserve this habitat so it can be enjoyed by my children. But all of those have an aggregate positive value that can influence the trajectory that the Earth is on.
This idea of hope is probably the reason that I wanted to invite you on the program here and sit virtually across the table from you, because I think that my instinct is that there is a massive missed opportunity here where environmental doomerism, the kind of despair and despondency that we're talking about in the secular world, is just running rampant, and Christians have a uniquely potent source of hope to offer on this issue if we were engaged seriously, if we were interested in getting beyond platitudes or political identities and actually dealing with it. And that hope is grounded not just in our role in creation and the fact that this world is good and God made it and we're not an encroachment, we're supposed to be here, but in the fact that there is hope for the ultimate future of creation. And this is where we get into the article that Sarah Pulliam Bailey wrote in the Post mentioned dispensationalism as a theology that for much of the 20th century convinced a lot of evangelicals that, and many of those listening will hold to this theology. So I'm not trying to bash anyone on the head, but the eschatology of dispensationalism teaches that this world is doomed. This world is going to be burned up. What we do here ultimately will not matter beyond the spiritual. And some may quibble and say that's a little bit of a caricature, but I think that's the general thrust of how most people understand it. If you have a different eschatology, if you have a more hopeful eschatology, or one that sees what we do in this world as important for the long run, say, for instance, an N.T. Wright with like a more post-millennial outlook, that changes the picture. That changes a lot of how you approach this world. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on how the idea of a restored creation can inform us now as Christians and can equip us to reach out to a secular world on this issue that is pretty much dominated by despair at this point, by a sense of doom. What can we offer because of our, because of what Scripture says about the ultimate fate of the world?
Right. One of the things I think we need to be cautious about offering is escapism. Mm-hmm. And that is what you were referring to with, the kind of fundamentalist perspective that it's all going to burn and we're going to escape into some grand eternity elsewhere. That's not appealing to my non-Christian colleagues. And I prefer to see, as you were mentioning, hope in terms of more of the N.T. Wright model of God is going to fully restore the earth into what it was fully intended to be originally, and that we have been invited by him into this magnificent opportunity to work alongside him in that process of restoration. That's the worldwide restoration project, and that restoration project extends not only to humans are central, but well beyond humans to the rest of the earth. And what a grand and great and wonderful opportunity we have to do that. So Richard Buckham, a theologian, writes about environmentalism and hope, and says that for Christians, there are two forms of hope. There's proximate hope and ultimate hope. Proximate hope is the unsure, uncertain hope that as we engage, we can produce good results. And so it takes strong motivation, it takes courage, it takes diligence, it takes effort, and the outcome will forever be uncertain. So I can, bust my butt to care for everything around me, and whether it has a good, positive, long-term outcome is uncertain. But then for Christians, there is, of course, also the ultimate hope that when Christ comes again, that creation will be restored. And that is sure and certain. So we hold those two kind of in balance. And just because we hold to the second doesn't mean that we can dismiss the first, because that is part of our call and challenge as caretakers of creation, is to be working toward that end now and not just kind of sitting around waiting for it.
Well, that's one of the coolest suggestions that we brought up N.T. Wright, so I'll use him as an example that he brings up in, I think it's Surprised by Hope, where he says that I'm not certain how, but in some sense, Scripture seems very clear that the things we do now are taken up into God's project of restoration and have the capacity to endure. So, when you get down to something as nitty-gritty as ecology, that has some tantalizing implications. That could mean that the things that we do, the way we treat the world right now, has a bearing on what the world eventually looks like. I mean, that this restoration project, Jesus doesn't say, behold, I will make all things new in the future. He says, behold, I am making all things new. And this is written to a church in the first century, right? So this is not some far off pie in the sky hope. And obviously the Great Commission is not primarily focused on the natural world, but we would be deeply mistaken if we didn't see implications for the natural world, because that's part of God's world. It's part of his creation. It's part of what he said is very good. So, I mean, this is just this is a subject for fruitful conversation, and we have just barely touched on that issue. I want to wrap up the program with this idea of the spark of hope that you see in people when there's a creation connection, when you take them on these walks and you show them the plants and animals, when you silence them and they hear the trees rustling in the breeze, when they step into that brook or they put their feet in the river and experience it on their skin. What does it look like when someone turns that corner? How do you know you've accomplished what you set out to do?
Wonderful question. Once again, it's a gradual process, right? We're not simply flipping a switch here. Mm-hmm. We're helping people to mature and grow in areas that they didn't even know existed, that they didn't know that there is an avenue of personal maturation and growth. But when I feel that the switch has been flipped is when, after some spending time together, whether it's canoeing in the wilderness or taking my grandsons out looking for tadpoles or salamanders, when they come to me and say, hey, do you think we could do this? Or when they, kids, they want to take it home and care for it and nurture it, or they want to go do the activity again. And then when they start building the connections, because my grandkids, my grandsons live in California, and annually they go look for salamanders in these hillside ponds around San Francisco. And a couple of years ago, they'd had a drought, and the ponds are dried up, and there were no salamanders. And then they start making the connections. Oh, our climate is changing. I'm really sad. Is that going to affect the salamanders? Are they ever going to be back? And so you start integrating these connections between what they love, what they aspire to do, and then bringing that about in terms of, okay, we really enjoy these things. Now we all have responsibilities to adjust our lives so that we can continue to enjoy them, and so that other people can enjoy them as well. So I think, I look for indications, I look for hints, I look for progress. And I'm still on that journey myself. I've not, arrived. And so sometimes I look for evidence in my own life of, am I becoming more aware of and embedded within and caretaking of the creation around me? So I look for signposts and hints, if that helps.
Because people will, as you said in the Washington Post piece, care for what they love. And so this whole conversation is really rooted in establishing that love, inviting people into a love for the natural world, and helping them see, just like your grandsons did, that there's something here that is beautiful, that's majestic, that's points to transcendent truths, and is worth preserving, is worth caring for. And so I think this conversation has been a really valuable, step for me toward doing that, and hopefully for my listeners. Dr. Lindroth, can you tell me where my listeners can go to read more of your work, find out more about you, etc.?
Sure. If they want to know about my science, I have a website. All they would have to do is Google my last name, Lindroth, Lindroth, ecology, and my university website would pop up. But most of them are probably not interested in those scientific articles. Most of them will probably be interested in some of my more environmentally oriented reflections. Most of those are posted with the organization BioLogos, BIOLOGOS, BioLogos. And so if you went to biologos.org and put in my name, you'd find a number of articles there. And if you hold on another week or two, or do it again in a week or two, there will be a new article published addressing some of these very points that we've discussed here in our conversation today.
Terrific. Well, my guest today has been Dr. Rick Lindroth. He's a professor of ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and was recently profiled in the Washington Post, calling for an ecology motivated by hope and seen through the lens of faith. Dr. Lindroth, thanks for this conversation. This was wonderful.
Thanks so much for having me, Shane, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and your audience.